Hi everyone, it's Rebecca Clayfish for the 1848 Project. We want to give you something to think about. So I talked to my friend, former Milwaukee Police Department Public Information Officer and Advisory Board member Ken Harris about a public policy idea you might not have heard about. Take a look.
We've talked a lot over the last several weeks about the importance of body cameras for both accountability and transparency. First off, is that a good first step?
I think it would be a good first step, but you have to remember that law enforcement has been not only advocating body cams, but have been using them in multiple departments throughout the country. So I don't think it's something new. I think it may be something that communities have recently heard about that's been ongoing. And so law enforcement has always been on the cusp of innovation and trying to move forward to make themselves more transparent and more accountable.
But one of the most innovative ideas that I have heard of that has not really been widely discussed publicly, I don't think, has been an idea that you shared with me a few weeks back when we were having a conversation just post Kenosha. And you suggested that this is something that we ought to at least talk about. We ought to at least examine. Can you tell me about this officer override policy?
I think that it's something that many departments currently already do. Again, it may sound like I'm 100%, this is what, pro law enforcement, but like everyone else in America, there's 1 or 2% of us that do things wrong, and they have to be not only corrected, but they have to take ownership. And in taking ownership, what many agencies have done is many of the policies that we use to train in many of the states talk about and suggest officer override if an officer is having a stressful day or they're simply not handling a call productively. What some departments are actually doing is they're actually codifying it and putting in their policy that clearly says that not only if you see an officer interacting with a citizen and it's not going well, you are, by standard operating procedure, you are ordered to hereby engage and remove the officer, not in a physical sense, but in a way to take over the call so that you can calm things down, make sure everyone stays safe. Part of that policy should also say that that officer should then make sure that once they've been overridden, they have to accept it. There's no, well, I decided that you tried to override me and I'm not gonna let you. You have to allow the officer to override you, because you can always deal with it and fix it later. From there, the officer then takes over. If you've been overridden, you now have to decide, should I stay here and be the cover officer, or do I need to leave completely because the officer can handle it, it's safe, and I'm just in a bad emotional way. Once that's done, then that officer who conducted the override would then go through what we call the chain of command, report it to their sergeant or corporal. It should go to the lieutenant and up the chain to whoever the chief or superintendent or sheriff is, so that we now have a record that this officer, Officer Harris was having a bad day, and Officer Clayfish overrode the officer. And now Officer Clayfish writes a letter saying, day, date, and time. This is what happened. I overrode the officer accepted it. Everything went great. That way, if you do get a complaint, one, you have the genesis of what exactly happened, and you have an idea of what was done to override it. That will probably lower complaints against law enforcement officers. But in that same vein, everybody, the citizen, the officer that was overridden, the officer doing the override, everybody is safe.
An officer override situation, there's no guarantee, but may have prevented a death in the case of the George Floyd situation with Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis.
I don't know the particulars of, did anyone call 911? Did anyone request a supervisor to come to the scene? Most law enforcement agency cultures dictate that being quasi-military, you have to follow the rank and file structure, right? And so I think what could have happened in that case is that with officer override, it won't matter what your rank is. It won't matter how long you've been on the job. It doesn't matter whether you've had 2 weeks, 2 years, or 2 decades. That officer override is an order from the chief of police. Thus, that officer that was there on field training for 8 days or the officer that had 8 years on, doesn't matter. Your job, you are hereby ordered to override that officer. That means remove them.
But how do you then prevent a subordinate who overrides a senior officer from feeling any, social or otherwise repercussions for telling a senior officer that they need to get out of the way and they are in fact taking over? How do you build in protection for someone who does the right thing and follows the rules?
When it's a rule and a procedure, now everyone is held to the same standard. Now each individual, and something I've argued with some of my colleagues, that it's not about transparency and it's not about accountability, it's also about ownership. Now you have to take ownership, not only that you acted and overrode someone, but now you have to take ownership because you didn't. And everyone's held to the same standard. Before, it's optional whether or not you should override someone, and it's optional based on your culture, the culture of the department, the culture of what's going on in the community. Whereas when it's a standard operating procedure, it doesn't say you should, it says you will. And in that instance, regardless of rank, everybody's held to the same standard. That'll then protect you. So if someone is upset or if someone gets mad, you're actually covered because it was a legal, lawful order.